Howdy everybody, I'm Howie Wolk and welcome to the 15th, believe it or not, Annual Wild Rockies Rendezvous. Mike Bader asked me to make a brief announcement before we really get going, and that is that at 8:30 on Saturday morning, we will be holding a rally at the, where is it, Mike? At the Urey Lecture Hall at the university, where the illustrious Helen Chenoweth, Congressman Helen Chenoweth, as she likes to be called, and Montana's own Rick Hill will be holding congressional field hearings on so-called forest health and forest fires. And of course, the solution to the problem is to log the forest, pave them over, and then we won't have to worry about fires. So make that a note on your rendezvous schedules for 8:30 on Saturday morning to put on a real show over there, okay? That's real important. It is a real privilege to be able to be up here and introduce Dave Foreman, our keynote speaker. Dave is one of my oldest friends, and he's also a good friend that I've known a long time. In fact, I've known Dave since we were both wet behind the ears and with hair upon our heads. And the one thing I can tell you about Dave Foreman, probably above and beyond anything else, is this is a man who has dedicated his entire adult life to saving and protecting wilderness, wildlands, restoring habitat, to protecting the wildlife and indeed all components of the ecosystem that go with wilderness habitat. And Dave is one of the true wilderness wildland conservation luminaries of the 20th century. Now, there's been some rumors floating around about Dave that I think I need to clarify. And one of those rumors is that at least 15 or so years ago in a bar in Moab, Utah, where Dave was being confronted in a rather unfriendly manner by a uranium miner who was in favor of the Reagan administration's plan to bury the nation's nuclear waste in a dark, shady canyon or roadless canyon next to Canyonlands National Park, that Dave, with his immense imagination, came up with an alternative for nuclear waste disposal that was in a similarly dark, shady canyon, specifically in the posterior quadrant of Nancy Reagan's anatomy. And I want to really clarify this and say that without doubt, it is absolutely true that Dave did make that suggestion. Another vicious rumor that's circulating about Dave Foreman is that a few years ago on a camping trip in the Arizona desert, Dave got out of his sleeping bag on a dark, moonless night to take a leak and promptly stepped off the edge of an arroyo, fell down, and broke his ribs. And I also want to assure you that this great wilderness luminary of the 20th and early 21st century did indeed do exactly that. As I said, I've known Dave since I was in my early 20s, Dave's mid-20s, since we both had hair on our head, and I won't go into the rest of it, but I've known Dave for a long time, and there's a few things about Dave Foreman, his character and his abilities, that really stand out and that I really admire. And the first thing, obviously, is his single-minded, focused dedication to wilderness and wildlands. And I think that's something for everybody to strive for, everybody who cares about what's happening to our planet. Another thing about Dave is he has an incredible intellectual capacity to look at a situation, garner facts and information, and also use his gut instinct to make a good, solid, well-informed decision, to be able to really grasp an issue or even a complex set of issues better than most people that I've ever dealt with. And Dave also has the capacity to turn this ability to understand what's happening in wildland conservation into action and to really get down and crank out valuable work that will help people protect wildlands, to protect and restore wildlands. In fact, I've only known a couple of people in my life who have that same capability. Certainly not me. I'm a lazy sloth compared to the way Dave is capable of cranking out work. And I think that's something that is inspirational to us all. And finally, again, Dave Foreman has been focused on wilderness. I've already said that, so I'll move on to the next thing, and that's that Dave Foreman started off his conservation career in New Mexico and quickly became a field representative for the Wilderness Society, and not many people around here realize that when Dave was working as a Southwest field rep for the Wilderness Society, he was working under the leadership of our own Stuart Brandborg, founder of Friends of the Bitterroot, and everybody around here knows Brandy very well. And then when Brandborg was forced out of the Wilderness Society, and in my opinion, the society started to go downhill, Dave left it, and in 1980 co-founded Earth First. 10 years later, when Earth First was heading in a little different direction, Dave left that and went on to found the Wildlands Project and become founder and publisher of its publication arm, Wild Earth Journal, which I believe is essential reading for anybody who's interested in tying in the exciting and fairly recent findings of conservation biology into grassroots conservation efforts to actually save and restore wildlands. And that's what Dave's been doing recently. He's recently helped to coordinate and finish a report on tying together the Sky Islands wildland ecosystem in the Southwest, which is really kind of a sister effort to the NAREPA effort to protect, restore, and reconnect habitat and corridors in the Northern Rockies. And Dave has also found time among all this work to write a novel that'll be out in a couple months, I think he told me earlier. 1 month it'll be out, and you can buy it through Wild Earth, and it's called The Lobo Outback Funeral Home. So keep an eye out for Dave's novel. I think it's going to be a great one. I'll stop. Without anything else, Dave Foreman.
It's a real pleasure to be here. My only complaint is that Mike Bader hasn't invited me before now. Number 15, gee. Don't think much of me, Mike. But it's great to be here, and it's such an honor to be introduced by my old buddy Howie Walk. I really thought about bringing a series of slides of Howie over the last 25 years to show his changing style, but I decided not to. But let me just say that I don't think anybody more than Howie deserves the name Mr. Wilderness of our generation. I mean, Howie has always put wilderness at the center of everything, and I am so goddamn happy that the entire conservation movement has come back to the centrality of wilderness and is seeing wilderness as the most important thing, seeing the National Wilderness Preservation System as the best idea we ever had. I'd like to apologize for three things. One, I'm a little disoriented. I've got this massive ear infection and a blown eardrum, so I can't really hear very well, and I'm sort of confused, though people like Howie would say that's nothing different. Secondly, I'm violating one of my cardinal rules, is that whenever I come for a speaking engagement, I stay for the entire conference. And I'm sorry I can't do that here because I'd accidentally agreed to speak at the National Mountain Conference in Golden, Colorado tomorrow, so I won't be here for the whole conference, and I'm very deeply sorry for that. And thirdly, I'm sorry that I'm not going to be talking about the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act. or even about Yellowstone to Yukon, or even about the Northern Rockies. I'm going to be talking about another part of the country, but I think you will see just how inspiring the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act has been elsewhere. If I could have the screen and the lights and the slides, and we're going to do something really marvelous. You know, we've got all this high-tech computer stuff going on now. And because I give so many slideshows, I've actually had a laser pointer, laser slide changer embedded in my finger. And so I'm going to be able to use it to just point back to Bob Clark, and he is going to be moved to turn the slide projector to advance the next slide. And so we are dealing with really a high-tech presentation here tonight, and you all are the first to witness it. The 25-cent finger here. Okay, if I could have the first slide, Bob. Okay, thank you. In 1937, Aldo Leopold wrote, "To my mind, these hillsides of live oak, fat with side oats grama." Oops, you can't see my finger now. How about if I stand over here where you can see my finger? These mesa tops, full of spangled with wildflowers and pine trees, and these burbling trout streams crowned by giant sycamores and cottonwoods come to my mind as being the cream of creation. What Leopold was talking about was a land on the Cordillera of North America on the Mexico-United States border. This region here, from the Gila Wilderness south into the Sierra Madre of Mexico. A region where the Nearctic and the Neotropics overlap in North America, where the Southern Rockies spruce fir forest and the pine oak forest of central Mexico combine to create one of the most diverse landscapes in North America. A landscape of high mountains, high montane grasslands, Chihuahuan desert with Sky Island mountains rising out of it, high mountain river valleys, Madre and evergreen woodland up from Mexico, southwestern rivers. What this landscape is a place where we can preserve the neotropics in the United States. It's the Sky Islands planning area. It's half in the United States and half in Mexico. And I'm sorry that we don't have a reserve design done for Mexico yet. This is the U.S. portion in southwestern New Mexico and southeastern Arizona. But because of all kinds of political, land use, and other situations in Mexico, the Mexico part has to wait. But what we have done with the Sky Islands Wildlands Network Conservation Plan is build a reserve system in the United States that depends very heavily on Mexico for its full integrity. Now, the Wildlands Project has a mission. And this mission has largely been inspired by the Alliance for the Wild Rockies, except we have taken it onto a continental scale. It is to protect and restore the ecological integrity and native biodiversity of North America through the establishment of a continental system of conservation reserves. In other words, starting from the Narepa to expand throughout the continent to protect all the diversity of life. And this idea is built on something I think Mike Bader and other folks here intuitively knew some 10 years ago when they developed Narepa, is that any landscape level conservation plan has to depend on large carnivores, large core areas, and connectivity in the landscape. And as we know, the first landscape level expression of this idea began right here with the conceptual plan for Narepa. That if Yellowstone National Park isn't large enough to maintain healthy populations of grizzlies and wolverines 100 years from now, then Yellowstone has to be protected and connected to the central Idaho wilderness areas, to the Glacier Bob Marshall country, and north into the Rockies of Canada. The Sky Islands Wildlands Network is based on a number of different elements drawn from Narepa, but building on those. And I'd like to present some of these ideas to you tonight. In most conservation plans today, an important part of it is ecosystem representation. But in the Sky Islands Conservation Plan, we are trying to do ecosystem representation by using carefully selected focal species. Michael Soule tells us that it's hard to know how much of a certain forest type really needs to be protected. But we can figure that out if we look at focal species, at those animals that need certain habitat types, and then protect enough habitat for them so that they have a viable population. And these focal species come in a variety of categories. But the most important categories are habitat quality indicator species. In the Sky Islands, this is like the Mexican spotted owl or northern goshawk, who indicate the integrity of an ecosystem. Or keystone species, those species that have a disproportionate effect on the ecosystem, like top carnivores like the mountain lion. Another central part of any real conservation plan today is ecosystem restoration. And here the Sky Island Alliance, with the support of the Forest Service, is closing roads in sensitive habitat. And I will get later into our approach to ecosystem restoration, which is healing the ecological wounds upon the land. And of course, fundamental to any real conservation plan is the protection of large core areas. Reed Noss and his co-authors in Continental Conservation tell us that without large, strictly protected core areas, a conservation plan is not a conservation plan. And as I'll talk about later, core areas must be wilderness areas and areas similar to wilderness. In the Sky Islands Conservation Plan, we began by looking at protected areas, the Gila Wilderness Area, Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge, and others as the building blocks of a serious wildlands network. It's also important to look at private lands. And we're fortunate in the Sky Islands region of New Mexico and Arizona that a number of large private ranches owned by people like Ted Turner and Drum Hadley are managed for protection of large carnivores, for restoration of riparian areas, and for the protection of all the biological diversity. In addition, a number of little nature conservancy preserves are also important. And so we have a high reliance on private lands in our Sky Islands Wildlands Network Conservation Plan. These include nature conservancy reserves, large private reserves like Drum Hadley's Guadalupe Canyon Ranch. When Hadley bought this ranch 30 years ago, where he's standing now was bare dirt with no grass. But by being the heir of Anheuser-Busch and taking the cows off the ranch for a couple of decades, by reintroducing natural fire, he has brought Guadalupe Canyon back to be one of the premier natural areas in the country. We're also looking at key private inholdings in national forests that have grazing allotments, inholdings that are important as linkages for large carnivores, but also areas that are badly managed at the present time, trying to identify these places to buy the owners out and retire the grazing allotments. Throughout the western United States, we see the lords of yesteryear dying by the score. The range livestock industry no longer makes economic or ecological sense. The big mining companies are pulling up stakes and moving. With the fires of this summer, we've seen just how depauperate the ideas of the industrial logging industry are. But what are the compatible uses on the land? How can people still make a living on public lands and private lands? In the Sky Islands Wildlands Network Conservation Plan, we've tried to develop those ideas and look at what's being done. Ideas like wolf country beef from Jim Winder and Will Holder, where ranchers are publicly supporting the recovery of wolves, are producing organic beef, doing no predator control, and then are trying to market their beef as wolf country beef throughout grocery stores. Similarly, what are the economic incentives we can use for wolf recovery, for jaguar recovery, and other conservation efforts? Defenders of Wildlife's program to pay ranchers for depredations by wolves is only one of many different approaches. Now, a lot of science-based conservation design today is being done just by GIS. It's being done on computers. And you know the old saying, garbage in, garbage out. You absolutely have to get down on the ground like you folks in Montana and we in the Southwest know. Get out and track large carnivores, know exactly what their linkages are between large core areas. We're radio collaring jaguars in Mexico to find out what routes they're taking to get to the United States, to find out where their breeding areas in Mexico are, so we can better build a conservation plan where we will have breeding jaguars back in Arizona and New Mexico again. These are in addition to the standard field work of inspecting wilderness boundaries and developing good wilderness proposals. We have also relied on specific units in the Sky Islands Wildlands Network. We have over 160 individual units, ranging from 3 different kinds of core areas to 3 different kinds of compatible use areas to 4 different kinds of landscape linkages. These areas range from the obvious of designated and proposed wilderness areas to places like Pima County's Cienega Creek Ecological Reserve. Let's look at the whole landscape of county lands, state lands, private lands, federal lands, and see how they all tie together. And it's important when we come out with a conservation plan to send it out for expert review. Expert review by scientists, but also expert review by on-the-ground conservationists who know if something's going to work or not. And finally, we have to get the word out. We have to spread the message. We have to do outreach, and I don't think anybody knows that better than the Alliance for the Wild Rockies, that has done a world-class job of promoting NARIPA over the last decade. Here, members of the New Mexico Wilderness Alliance are sending out flyers on the Sky Islands plan. And finally, and this is something you all in Montana didn't need to know when you developed NARIPA, that you have to have an implementation plan. But in many cases, people doing scientific-based reserve design don't develop it with an implementation plan. And we are arguing that an implementation plan has to be developed hand in glove with the Wildlands Network design. This includes the standard lobbying in Washington, D.C., the organizing of citizens across the country that creates 100 co-sponsors of something like NARIPA. It includes getting down and testifying at hearings. It includes things like the roadless area implementation strategy. For us in the Sky Islands, in Arizona and New Mexico, where once the thick-billed parrot bred in the Gila and Apache National Forest, it involves in getting down on the ground in Mexico. This is a Sebadius old-growth forest, 150 miles south in Mexico, the largest remaining tract of old-growth forest left in Mexico and the main breeding ground of the thick-billed parrot. The thick-billed parrot once ranged throughout central Arizona and New Mexico, and we can bring it back. But we can only bring it back if we protect its breeding habitat in Mexico and help it expand its numbers so that it will travel north to begin breeding in the States again. Last December, the Wildlands Project, Naturalia, Pro Natura in Mexico, signed an agreement with the Sebadius ejido, which is a community land grant in Mexico, to protect the old-growth forest, to keep it from logging, to develop ecotourism for them, to show them that they can make more money off bird watchers going into the wildest reaches of the Sierra Madre without fear of narcotraficantes to see thick-billed parrots and trogons and other things than they could by logging off the old-growth forest for a one-time deal. This is what we're trying to do in Mexico so that we will have parrots and jaguars and ocelots and other species back in the States. So implementation takes all kinds of forms. And one day, Howie Wolk, leading his trips in the Gila National Forest, will be able to show his clients thick-billed parrots eating pine cones and breeding in cavities in conifer trees. This is the way it's supposed to be in the Southwest, and this is the way it will be again if we can do as good a job in the Southwest as you all are doing here with NAREPA. Now, the idea behind modern conservation, I think, is becoming more and more based on the idea of rewilding, as developed by Michael Soule. And I include this slide in my talks to show that Michael Soule is not just a biology professor, but he's somebody who really gets into the wilderness. But the idea behind rewilding is that you have to have large core reserves, you have to have connectivity across the landscape, and you have to have keystone species and processes. Fundamentally, large carnivores, which are keystone species, and keystone processes like natural fire require large core areas in which to operate. But we don't have large enough core areas any longer in the lower 48, so we have to have landscape linkages to tie areas together. There are many values behind large carnivores. One of those is their role as an umbrella species. If we really protect habitat for a viable population of Mexican wolves or Rocky Mountain wolves, then we are going to protect many other species as well. This is called the umbrella effect. Even more important than the umbrella idea is the role of large carnivores in top-down regulation of ecosystems. Jim Estes first started talking about this when he studied sea otters on the North Pacific coast. Where sea otters are present, there are healthy kelp forests, which are like the old-growth forests of the ocean. But you remove the sea otters, and the kelp forests are completely wiped out because the prey of the sea otter, the sea urchin, when there are no sea urchins around, overpopulate and they completely destroy the kelp forest. You put sea otters back in, they begin to eat the sea urchins, and the kelp forests come back. This is top-down regulation. Similarly, in the eastern United States, we've known for a long time that neotropical migrant songbirds like vireos, warblers, tanagers are in trouble. We know part of the problem is because their wintering grounds in Central America and Mexico are being destroyed. We also know that their summer breeding grounds in the eastern United States and Canada are being fragmented, like this industrial clear-cut in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. When we fragment the forest like this, brown-headed cowbirds can penetrate up to half a mile into the forest and lay their eggs in the songbird nest. But there's another reason for the decline of songbirds in the eastern United States. Mountain lions, wolves. Now, it's not because a mountain lion skulks through the forest trying to find warbler nests and sucking eggs. Some things are not done in nature, and there is no self-respecting mountain lion on earth that is going to seek out warbler nests and eat baby warblers. I mean, that'd be like John Wayne getting a nipple ring. Some things just don't happen. But what it is that if you get rid of the mountain lions and the wolves, mesopredator release. There is a population explosion of these guys. Raccoons, foxes, skunks, which don't have a John Wayne ethic and do skulk through the forest and suck eggs and eat baby warblers. You get rid of the large carnivores, and there is a population explosion of the mid-sized carnivores. There is also a behavioral release. Suddenly, these guys begin to act a lot bolder. I had to beat this raccoon away from my ice chest in Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge with my paddle. But as soon as a bobcat showed up, that raccoon was gone. You know, you don't have the big guys around, these little guys start acting uppity. And you just got to slap them back in the corner with a paddle or a mountain lion. And Michael Soule and his graduate students have done a lot of work in Southern California. As San Diego spreads out like a cancer over the coastal sage scrub, a number of canyons have been left in their native vegetation, but surrounded by suburbs. What Soule and his graduate students discovered is that as long as a canyon has coyotes in it, it keeps all its native birds. But as soon as the coyotes are gone, the birds disappear. And that is because no smart cat like my cat, Chama, goes out when there are coyotes around. I'm going to leave Chama's picture on the screen for a while because she's my best friend, and I think the most beautiful cat there's ever been. And I miss her because I'm on the road right now. But it's the same thing in the canyons of San Diego. You get rid of the coyote, and the house cats, the foxes, the skunks, the possums go into the canyons and clean out the native birds. The coyotes come back into the canyons and they eat the foxes and the possums and the house cats, or the house cats learn to stay at home. Mesopredator release. Large carnivores prevent this. In Isle Royale in Lake Superior, when there is a healthy population of wolves, there is a healthy population of moose, which means there's a healthy population of balsam fir. But when there is a low population or no wolves, there is too big of a population of moose and the forest suffers. This is called a trophic cascade, and it's been shown all over the world in a whole variety of ecosystems. So why do we need large carnivores? Why the emphasis on large carnivores? It's because we're seeing in marine ecosystems and tropical ecosystems and temperate ecosystems and ecosystems all around the world that without large carnivores, you lose ecosystem integrity. And that when we return large carnivores like wolves to Yellowstone, things change. The elk begin to behave like elk again. They are no longer fat, lazy substitute for cows loafing around, eating willows and overgrazing meadows. They're looking around over their shoulder. They're running around. They're hoping that goddamn wolf takes somebody next to them and not them, but they're moving. They're elk again. And this is why we need large carnivores to make nature nature once again. And finally, for us as human beings, why do we need large carnivores? Because the one quality that we have in abundance today is arrogance. And there is nothing like encountering a track like this to teach you humility. Facing a natural fire, facing a grizzly on the trail, seeing the track of a jaguar, hearing the howl of a wolf, helps us relearn who we really are, that we are not gods, that we are not masters of the universe. It teaches us humility, and we need, I think, humility more than anything else in the world today. I might say that particularly your politicians of the Northern Rockies need humility. And I think I would love to see what Helen Chenoweth would do coming upon a fresh track of this, like this. I'll bet her voice would get even squeakier. Now, fundamental to the whole idea of landscape protection and protecting large carnivores is protecting wilderness areas. This is the core of what we're all about. And the wilderness idea is not outdated. It's even more important today than it's ever been. But a lot of people, ranging from the Helen Chenoweths to the postmodern deconstructionist professors in the ivory towers of academia, have been confusing the idea of wilderness lately. And particularly the overeducated professors keep asking all these bizarre questions that only they can come up with. And I always think of them staring like my nephew Benny Pacheco here, wondering what it's really all about. But you know, when I hear their questions, I think about Linus Pauling, the great chemist, who once wrote that he had read a book on philosophy. And this philosopher went on and on, page after page after page, words, 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 about the essence of leafness. And whether a leaf, when it was green in the spring, was still the same leaf when it was red in the fall. And Pauling said, words, words, words. But the only words that mean anything in this conversation, xanthophyll and chlorophyll, never appear. And so it is with the postmodern deconstructionist critics of wilderness. They create this phony literary idea of wilderness and begin to deconstruct it without ever beginning to investigate the real idea of wilderness, the idea of wilderness that has led generations of us to create the National Wilderness Preservation System. And I think it's important that we get back to understanding what wilderness really is. Wilderness fundamentally means self-willed land. From the old English wilderness, land with a will of its own, self-willed land. And closely tied to the idea of self-willed land is the wildeor, the wild beast, the self-willed animal. And let me tell you, when I was sitting 30 feet away from this pride of 10 lions, turning a 1,000-pound kudu into skin and bone, I understood their will. And I knew that if they decided to, that they could easily make me desert. And being that close to something so totally free, so self-willed, helped me understand even more the importance of wilderness and of self-willed land. And this is our reaction against the wildy ore, against self-willed land. This is the last grizzly bear killed in Mexico in the 1960s. And we did it in Montana, we did it in New Mexico, we did it in Mexico. We do it all over the world, and we've been doing it for 1,000 years. By parading the defeated self-willed beast, the Grendel, we became heroic Beowulfs, exerting our civilized will upon the land, putting our imprint on it, smashing out any will other than our own. And this is exactly what the United States Forest Service has been doing in Montana and New Mexico for 100 years, stamping out the will of the land, and they continue to do it. And Mark Roscoe and Helen Chenoweth and all the other pea-brains and servitude to the timber industry and the mining industry and the livestock industry want to go on stamping out the will in the land, stamping out the self-willed beasts, so we puny little hominids can stand up on our hind feet and feel important, that we have overcome Grendel. But wilderness, the idea of protected wilderness areas, is the opposite of that attitude. And Aldo Leopold in the 1920s wrote, "What value are 40 freedoms without a blank spot on the map in which to be young?" And this was the idea behind the first wilderness areas. Leopold saw wilderness areas as a refuge from Ford dust. After World War I, automobiles were invading the backcountry of the national forests. Leopold feared that soon no one in the Forest Service would know how to tie a diamond hitch or use a crosscut saw. And I have to wonder if he is right. But Leopold saw wilderness areas as places for quality hunting and fishing. And he said, in our American experience, we created two great ways of moving across the wilderness. One was the pack train, the other was canoeing. And our generations have created two other great ways of moving under our own power across wild country: backpacking and river running. The National Wilderness Preservation System, as it developed administratively under the Forest Service, and then when we as conservationists realized that the Forest Service after World War II was going to dismember their protected wilderness areas, the people like Howard Zahniser and Stuart Brandborg and Cliff Merritt and others stood up and began to work for congressional protection of wilderness areas in the 1964 Wilderness Act, which is the civilized world's greatest embrace of self-willed land and the civilized world's greatest embrace of humility and the recognition that some land should remain under its own will. What's important about the Wilderness Act to understand is that there are 4 definitions of wilderness in the Wilderness Act. The first comes in the purpose of the Wilderness Act, where it says, in order to prevent the destruction of wilderness by expanding settlement, growing mechanization, growing population, we are going to protect these areas for the heritage of all Americans. It recognizes that wilderness areas, foremost, are areas we are protecting from destruction by clear-cutting, road building, and other industrial destruction. The second definition of wilderness is the ideal definition. The wilderness areas are untrammeled. And it's important to understand what untrammeled means. Howard Zahniser, the head of the Wilderness Society at the time, was a wonderful wordsmith. He understood what words meant. Untrammeled does not mean untrampled. Trammel is an old French word that means a net or a hobble. It came into the English language over 500 years ago. To be untrammeled means to be free, to be unhobbled, to be self-willed, or as Michael Soule describes wilderness areas ecologically, as self-regulated ecosystems. And so untrammeled is a very important word and was used specifically by Sennheiser for that. But that is the ideal definition of wilderness. The third definition of wilderness is the practical definition of wilderness. Sennheiser and the sponsors of the Wilderness Act in the House and Senate knew that there were no totally pristine landscapes left in the United States or probably anywhere in the world. And in fact, the word pristine does not appear in the Wilderness Act. The practical definition of wilderness is land that generally appears to be affected primarily by the forces of nature. It recognizes that even in the Bob Marshall wilderness, there has been impact from human beings, that what we are doing is creating a practical system of wilderness areas, a system where we are going to protect and restore wilderness qualities and self-willed qualities. And so this third definition, which is the entry criteria for candidate wilderness areas, is a practical definition and does not include the word pristine. The fourth definition of wilderness is the criteria for how wilderness areas are going to be managed after they are designated. No permanent roads, no motorized vehicle, no mechanized equipment, no commercial operations. This is the criteria for how an area will be managed after it is protected. It is not the criteria an area must have for entry into the wilderness system. And too often conservationists fall into the Forest Service purity trap of thinking we can only propose totally roadless, pristine, untouched areas. Now this came to a head in the early 1970s. And as we switch to the other tray of slides, I just want to mention that wilderness areas are habitat, whether in Wyoming or down here in the Sky Islands Wildlands Network, are habitat for fierce, large, mean, dangerous carnivores. I bet you all don't know who that is. That's Howie. Next tray, please. But what's important for us to keep in mind as we propose wilderness is this whole call for purity is phony. The other thing to keep in mind is that if we read the criteria for wilderness in the Wilderness Act, we see that the experiential values of wilderness, the scenery, the inspiration, the recreational values are twined together with the ecological values of wilderness. The National Wilderness Preservation System is not just a recreational system. It is a system for protecting ecological values as well. This area on the Mexico border that has trogons and jaguars, the Pajarito Wilderness Area, is a place that blends these two ideas of the inspirational value of wilderness and the ecological value of wilderness together wonderfully. In the early 1970s, conservationists in the eastern United States, such as in the cranberry country of West Virginia, began to propose wilderness areas. But the United States Forest Service said, no, there is no wilderness in the east. And if we were going to protect any of these eastern areas as wilderness, these areas that had once been logged but that have grown back, we would tarnish the great western wilderness areas like the Bob Marshall and the Gila Wilderness. It would be like giving a craven coward the Congressional Medal of Honor. It would dishonor all of those brave souls who had won it. Well, conservationists in the East said bullshit to the Forest Service. And we stood up, and in hearing after hearing, Congress told the Forest Service that they didn't know what they were talking about. But let's just take a look at some of the arguments the Forest Service made. Because these eastern areas had once been logged, they were no longer wilderness. But areas in the west were pristine wilderness. But what about the huge herds of sheep and cattle that had ranged through the areas in Montana and New Mexico? What about a century of fire suppression? What about all the other things that had had ecological impact on our western areas? In fact, the western areas were no more degraded than the eastern areas were. And keep that in mind when people argue that our proposals have to be totally pristine. This is a constructed road in the Manzano Mountain Wilderness area in New Mexico. In 1976, Senator Pete Domenici and Representative Manuel Lujan included this constructed road in their wilderness proposal. And it was passed in the Endangered American Wilderness Bill in 1978 and is closed and protected as wilderness now. There are dozens of examples of this. So if we take an ecological view of wilderness, in the Sky Islands region, we know that jaguars in Arizona and New Mexico will need lower elevation stream bottoms like this. Now, this area has a minor dirt road in it, but we are proposing to close that road and include it as part of the Blue Range Wilderness area because we know this is important habitat for jaguars. We are justifying the inclusion of this area in wilderness because of its importance to the jaguar. Similarly, the Mexican wolf, now reintroduced some 25 strong in the Gila Apache National Forest. We know that their preferred habitat in southeastern Arizona and down into Mexico is Madrean evergreen oak woodland. And in many cases, it's this flat rolling country that has minor jeep trails or dirt roads in it. But we have also learned that where there are roads and wolves, wolves will die because the yahoos cruising the roads with their 30-06s. And so if we're really going to restore wolves in the Southwest, then we're going to have to close some minor dirt roads and jeep trails and prime Mexican wolf habitat and include those areas in our wilderness proposals. So if we begin to take a more ecological view of what wilderness is and what its purpose is, if we understand that wilderness areas do not have to be totally pristine, then we can make strong arguments for including a lot of ecologically important areas that may have minor intrusions in them as wilderness. Now, something we have tried differently in the Sky Islands Wildlands Network that I hope you all up here in the Northern Rockies will think about is an approach to ecological restoration that is built on Aldo Leopold's admonition about healing the wounds of the landscape. After visiting northern Mexico in 1937 and for the first time seeing a totally healthy landscape as compared to the degraded landscapes of Arizona and New Mexico, Leopold wrote that one of the penalties of an ecological education was to be aware that we lived alone in a world of wounds, and that the job of the ecologist was either to ignore those wounds and do nothing, or to become a land doctor and try to heal the wounds. So in developing the Sky Islands Wildlands Network Conservation Plan, we looked at the wounds of the landscape, and we discovered 6 major ecological wounds over the last 150 years. The elimination of many species of wildlife, the destruction of watersheds and riparian areas, the invasion of exotic plants, fragmentation of the landscape, control of natural fire, and degradation of forest ecosystems. Early on in the 1870s, as mining camps sprang up in Arizona and New Mexico, market hunters shot off the Coues white-tailed deer, the javelina, and other game species. They largely disappeared from the Southwest. PARC, the Predatory Animal and Rodent Control Agency of the Department of Interior, went after the wolves and created a pogrom to exterminate every wolf in the United States. Similarly, we went after killing the grizzlies. And this program of predator extermination worked very well indeed. For example, this was once the grizzly range in North America. And this is what it is today. In less than 100 years, we have come to this state. But it wasn't enough to kill off the carnivores. We had to exterminate the prairie dogs as well. Where once there had been millions of acres of prairie dog towns, now there were none. The prairie dog probably numbered 5 billion 120 years ago. It has been shot and poisoned down to less than 1% of its range and its number. And they were largely exterminated in the Sky Islands region. Spotted cats like the ocelot were trapped and shot for furs, exterminated from the United States and largely exterminated from northern Mexico as well. In addition to the wildlife being exterminated, watersheds and riparians have suffered greatly over the last 150 years in the Southwest. By 1840, the mountain men had trapped nearly all the beavers out of the Southwest. By the 1870s, mining camps like Bisbee had cleared all the woodlands around them. And so what happened when great herds of cattle moved in to Arizona and New Mexico in the 1880s? Without the beaver dams to check runoff and streams, without the woodland and forest to hold the soil, what had once been lush grasslands like this were grazed off to bare dirt like this. What had once been lush riparian areas were grazed off to barren ground like this. And where once there had been permanent streams, suddenly now we only had periodic flash floods carving deep-walled arroyos. That the entire hydrology of the region had been changed, that we had destroyed our riparian areas and endangered the many species that depended upon them. That was the second great wound in the Southwest. The third great wound has been the fragmentation of the landscape. And it's easy to see freeways like this as fragmenting habitat for Mexican wolves or jaguars. Even the wily coyote has trouble getting across a paved road. And if you're a slow-moving desert tortoise, even an ATV trail can be fatal. This particular tortoise was deliberately hit by the ATV. I traced its tracks, and they swerved just to hit the 60-year-old desert tortoise and kill it. I wouldn't be here today if I had found the driver of it. I can guarantee you that. We have also seen our rivers and streams fragmented by dams, by irrigation pumping, by agriculture areas and river bottomlands. Wherever we look, we have seen habitat fragmented, both for those species that depend on rivers and riparian areas, and for those species like wolves or grizzlies or wolverines or jaguars that require large expanses to move across. This is the area species curve. It doesn't look like a curve to you, but trust me, it's a curve. The vertical axis is the number of species of reptiles and amphibians. The horizontal axis is the area in square miles of islands in the Caribbean. If you look, you see a direct relationship between the size of the island and the number of species it has. This is a fundamental law of ecology. The larger the area, the more species it will have. The corollary to this is that as you destroy a habitat, you will lose species. If you destroy 90% of a certain habitat, you will lose 50% of the species in it. This is why habitat destruction and fragmentation is the #1 cause of extinction in the world today. The fourth great wound in the Southwest is the invasion of exotic species. And you all up here with your deer-spotted knapweed know that problem very well. In the Southwest, the bullfrog, bass, crawdads, all exotics to the region, are the #1 cause of endangerment for Chiricahua leopard frogs, for native fish species, and many other critters. It is the invasion of our riparian areas by exotics that is the coup de grace of our native species of fish and amphibians. The Southwest is also being invaded by exotic plants like Johnson grass and salt cedar or tamarisk. So the invasion of exotic species is a fourth great wound. The fifth great wound has been the attempted control of natural fire. Throughout the West, many of the ecosystems, particularly ponderosa pine, evolved with natural fire. This is a healthy ponderosa pine forest in the Gila wilderness. But the attempt to control fire, and did you know that the Forest Service's first fire crews were sheep and cattle? That it was a conscientious, deliberate policy of Gifford Pinchot to overgraze the national forest at the beginning to eliminate the grass that could carry the fire from tree to tree. That the original fire crews were sheep and cattle. And I don't think the people who run the Forest Service's fire program today are any smarter than those sheep of yore. But instead of the healthy forest we once had, we now have dog hair thickets like this in places where fire control has been successful in the Southwest. Closely tied to this has been the destruction of forest types. Over 130 years ago, as forests were scoured for fuel wood and mine timbers and railroad ties, to the first saw timber operations. Many of you know about the Chiricahua Mountains in southeastern Arizona, one of our crown jewels. But by 1900, over 18 sawmills in the Chiricahuas had already cut down 30% of the old-growth forests in the Chiricahuas, to the extent that we don't even know what the natural forest was like there. But it wasn't until after World War II, whether in New Mexico or Montana, that the Forest Service's industrial timber operations really geared up. To the extent that today, and in Mexico in the last 40 years, we have seen the destruction of a vast old-growth forest down to 0.17% of its former size. Illegal and legal logging operations in the Sierra Madre are stripping that great forest bare. And it is only through conscientious efforts that we can protect the remaining places. But through all this forest destruction, ponderosa pines like this, and my friend is 6'4", while once were common, are now rare in the Southwest. And so these six great wounds on the landscape become the goals of the Sky Islands Wildlands Network. That our mission is to heal the wounds by protecting a connected system of wildlands, a network of wildlands full of large carnivores, but specifically trying to heal each one of these six wounds. The restoration of the Mexican wolf to its full ecological function in the Southwest. And in our plan, we have management recommendations for every one of these species that go into great detail. Similarly for the jaguar which once ranged all the way north to the Grand Canyon, Santa Fe, and Arkansas. The jaguar that belongs in the American Southwest. The jaguar that was hunted out for its pelts and is a stock killer over the last 100 years. The jaguar that is now breeding only 100 miles south of Arizona and New Mexico. And out of that breeding population, dispersing males are being photographed nearly every year in either New Mexico or Arizona. By protecting their habitat in Mexico, we will bring them back to having breeding populations in Arizona and New Mexico again. And similarly, we have these detailed management recommendations for jaguars. We are working with the Fish and Wildlife Service to reintroduce black-footed ferrets on the world's largest remaining prairie dog town in Janos, Chihuahua, just 40 miles south of the U.S. border, to build a population of over 1,000 black-footed ferrets. So we'll have plenty to bring back in the United States for recovered prairie dog towns in New Mexico and Arizona. to bring back healthy populations of beavers, to restore streams, and particularly in some of the extremely damaged, overgrazed watersheds of the Southwest. Bighorn sheep, pronghorn, other important species, including bison. There is a small herd of bison in northern Mexico today that may be a genetic remnant of the southern population of bison, which was supposedly destroyed in the 1880s. But this small herd of bison in Chihuahua may go back to that southern herd. We're trying to do genetic testing now and restore this population of bison to its true role in the Chihuahuan desert grasslands. Restoring the northern goshawk, the Apache trout, and the other damaged species of the Sky Islands region becomes a major goal of the conservation plan. And the second great goal is to bring back damaged watersheds and riparian areas to their full health and integrity once again, by getting rid of the livestock along streams, by restoring watersheds, by getting beavers back in there, by building up the cottonwood and willow forest along the streams. Similarly, by returning natural fire to the landscape. This is a healthy ponderosa pine forest in the Gila Wilderness. This is the goal for what the landscape should begin to be. If you notice, look at the big trees. This was a cool ground fire that went through, taking out the little dog hair trees, but leaving the big yellow pines alone. Healing the fragmentation of the landscape. Looking at a map like this, which was the first reserve design map for the Sky Islands, and seeing where the choke points are, where the barriers are, where the freeways are, where the highways, where the dams, where the agricultural areas are, and trying to figure out how to get along them, around them. Interstate 10 here is a major barrier across southern Arizona, New Mexico for jaguars or wolves. But if you look down the road there, you see a little bridge. Underneath that bridge is Davidson Canyon, which Pima County around Tucson, Arizona, is trying to protect as an ecological corridor. Our experts on the ground, John Terborg and Brian Miller, who have studied jaguars throughout South America and Mexico, say that jaguars, Mexican wolves, ocelots will use a little corridor like that stream undercrossing of the freeway to get north to south. We have to identify these important places and protect them. And then we have to retrofit major barriers like freeways and highways so that we can get critters across. And fragmentation comes from yahoos like these. And this is why the roadless area moratorium is so important. It's why we have to work hard to make sure that the roadless area moratorium restricts off-road vehicles only to designated travel ways. We have to get jerks like this out of the canyon. These are the people that shoot wolves or jaguars when they get a chance. This is fragmentation of the worst kind, and I know you all know it very well up here in Montana. A comprehensive strategy to deal with exotics is another major goal of the Sky Islands Wildlands Network. To be able to restore native fish like these Gila chubs here away from their predators of largemouth bass and bullfrogs. To protect and restore native forests so that the species that depend on those native forests can flourish and come back. That ultimately the goal of the Sky Islands Wildlands Network Conservation Plan is to use all these methods, all these approaches, by looking at private land, at county land, at state land, at federal land, at wilderness areas, at nature conservancy preserves, at wildlife refuges, by looking at reintroduction of extirpated species, at restoration of riparian areas, at the return of natural fire, at economic incentives to help landowners do what is right. By putting all these things together, that once again we'll have a landscape a landscape big enough and wild enough that it can have a will of its own. That a fire like this is a thing of beauty. It's a way of the land expressing itself as an expression of ecological integrity. And knowing that in a landscape like this, wolves are once again whittling the swift legs of the elk and the pronghorn antelope. That once again we have helped the land find its own will. That once again we have found the humility to step back from dominating the land, from controlling it. That needing to express our will is considered somehow as something that junior high school boys would do. To somehow grow up so that no longer is the culture and custom of the West, the culture and custom of the teenage boy, by the teenage boy, for the teenage boy. Today and only today, no responsibility, no consequences of our action, just to express our own ego gratification and our own arrogance. And Helen Chenoweth, Mark Roscoe, they're teenage boys no matter what they look like. And it is a teenage boy that we have to overcome in our society. Because one of the cardinal rules of ecology is that there is nothing more expendable or pitiful than the adolescent male mammal. Now, if I could have the lights. I don't think anybody understood humility and the consequences of arrogance in our time better than Aldo Leopold. And I go back and I read Aldo Leopold at least every year. And I'm always amazed at what I find. And I realize that every good idea I've had over the last year, Aldo Leopold had come up with it 60 years earlier. And if I was a teenage boy, I'd be pissed off about it, that he got all the good stuff. But because I'm a nice, maturing, graying, mainstream member of our community, it helps my humility to understand just how wise Leopold was. But Leopold was once a teenage boy himself. And once upon a time, Leopold did not understand the consequences of his actions. And once upon a time, did not appreciate self-willed land. When he graduated from the Yale School of Forestry in 1909 and caught a train for the territory of Arizona and went to work for the United States Forest Service, his first job was to cruise timber in the White Mountain country of the Apache National Forest on the New Mexico border. For 2 weeks at a time, he and his crew of men would be out on horseback, counting trees. The Forest Service knew they wouldn't be able to log the White Mountains for decades, but they wanted to know what the standing volume was, and that was Leopold's job. On one of those trips in 1909, Leopold and his men had stopped to eat lunch on a rocky little outcropping overlooking a rushing stream below, and they ate their sandwiches of greasy bacon and biscuits, and they saw a doe ford the stream below them. At least they thought it was a doe at first because of her long legs. But when they saw a bunch of wolf pups come running out of the willows to greet their mother, they realized it was an old mama wolf. Well, in those days, any wolf you saw was a wolf you shot. And Leopold and his men ran to their horses, pulled the 30-30s from the scabbard, began to blast away at the pack of wolves down below. If you hunt like I do, you know it's hard to aim downhill. But a lot of lead went down the hill that day. And the old mama wolf crumpled. One of her pups dragged her shattered legs back in the willows to die a slow death. Leopold and his men mounted up on their horses and rode down the hill to skin out the varmints and pack their hides back to Springerville. Years later, Aldo Leopold wrote about that afternoon. He wrote, "We reached the old wolf in time to watch a fierce green fire die in her eyes. I knew then, and I've known ever since, that there was something new to me in the eyes of the wolf. Something known only to the wolf and to the mountain. I was young then and full of triggerage, because fewer wolves meant more deer. I believed no wolves would mean hunter's paradise. But after watching green fire die, I realized that neither wolf nor mountain agreed with such a view." That was in 1909. In 1998, almost a century later, wolves were released in the Apache National Forest, less than half a mile from where Leopold shot the green fire wolf. In those 90 years, we as a people somehow came around full circle from arrogance to humility. And it's not sure those wolves in Arizona and New Mexico are going to survive. Just like it's not sure that the wolves in Montana and Yellowstone are going to survive. But God, we have taken a giant step from arrogance to humility. And Leopold wrote, "The deep chesty bawl echoes from rimrock to rimrock, rolls down the mountainside and fades into the far blackness of the night. It's a cry of wild, defiant sorrow, of contempt for every adversity on earth." And that's what it takes if you're the wildeor, if you're the self-willed animal in this world of human beings. That's what it takes to survive, is contempt for adversity. But there's also something else in that howl of the wolf, which is the music of a party going on, which is a song of joy, and maybe more than anything else, the way to find humility, the way to let self-willedness come back into the land, the way to allow self-willed animals once again to roam free, is for us to find joy in self-willed landscapes and the wildeor. And there is no greater song of joy than the howl of the wolf that you know in Montana and that we finally know again in New Mexico and Arizona.